Welcome to another session of the Art of Meditation Summit. I'm Dr. Ron Siegel, a clinical psychologist at Harvard Medical School in the USA, and I'll be your host for the session. Today, I have the great pleasure of introducing a friend and longtime colleague, Dr. Sara Lazar. Welcome, Sara.
Hi, nice to be here.
Thanks so much for joining the summit. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And first, I'd like to share a little bit about your background with the audience, just so they have a sense of who you are and your work. So, Dr. Sara Lazar is a neuroscientist and an associate professor of psychiatry, associate professor in the psychiatry department at Mass General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. The focus of her research is to elucidate the neural mechanisms underlying the beneficial effects of yoga and meditation, both in clinical settings and in healthy individuals. She's been practicing yoga and mindfulness meditation personally since 1994, and her research has been covered by numerous news outlets, including the New York Times, USA Today, CNN, and WebMD. And I've had the pleasure of knowing Sara for a long time. And as I think you'll soon see, she's one of those scientists who really likes to be clear and honest about what we, the royal we, as humans know and don't know about the human brain under different conditions. And she's always been my go-to person for questions in this area, particularly when they're controversial, because she's really good at giving a balanced perspective. So I'm really happy, Sara, that you've agreed to join us on the summit. I wonder if I could start with something just a little bit about your interest in this, since you've had such extensive personal as well as scientific involvement with mindfulness meditation and yoga and other practices. What brought you to these practices? And what brought you to want to study these practices scientifically?
Right. So back when I was in grad school, I developed a sports injury, a running injury, and I went to see a physical therapist, and they said, stop running and just stretch. And as I was leaving the office of the physical therapist, I happened to notice an ad for a vigorous yoga class. And this is back almost 30 years ago now. At that point in time, yoga, was not well thought of here in the United States. It's equated with tinfoil hats. But the ad said that the yoga would promote flexibility and strength. And so I thought, okay, this would be a great way to stay in shape. So I went to the yoga class purely as a form of physical therapy. And, the teacher made all sorts of claims about this pose will do this for you. This pose will do that for you. I was like, yeah, I'm here to stretch. But very quickly, I started noticing that I was calmer, I was less reactive, I was more centered, more focused. And it really had a profound impact on me. And so I decided, and I knew that something was changing in my brain. It's like, it wasn't just while I was doing yoga, but when I was walking around during the day, how I saw people, how I interacted with people was changing, how I thought about people was changing, how I thought about things in general was changing. So I knew something in my brain was happening. So when I finished my PhD, I decided to switch, and I've been doing research on yoga and meditation ever since.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. And as you mentioned this, you're saying that it wasn't just while you're doing yoga, it wasn't just what we call state effects, but it was also something was lingering outside of the yoga session itself, what we tend to call trait effects. And I wonder if you could tell us in a general way about the difference between what you see neurobiologically as the state effects of different meditation practices versus their trait effects.
Right. So the idea is that, the brain's wired a certain way, and that, we all have a more or less unique pattern of wiring, but there are some commonalities in how everything is wired. But then, small variations in that give us the variations in our personality and whatnot. And so, of course, though, so say we have a normal set point, then we encounter something funny, of course, we're going to laugh, right? So that'd be like a state, but if even someone who's depressed, can, laugh at a joke, right? And so, but overall, their wiring of the brain makes their mood overall low and unhappy, but they can have momentary moments of happiness. And so what we see is that we can think of that sort of like a set point, right? And so that we can, temporarily move out of that set point, but then when those conditions go away, we go back to, depression or anxiety or normal happy. Some people are normally happy, but even if you're someone who's normally happy and, your pet dies, obviously you're going to have a moment, for a while you're going to be sad and depressed, but then that doesn't stick and you come back to your happy set point. So it's very much you can have perturbs, but then based on the wiring, you can have more sort of stable arrangements.
And what do you tend to find? Let's take. I don't know what you'd like to pick, but one of the findings that you see fairly consistently across different kinds of meditation practices. Can you describe a little bit what that looks like in the state of doing the practice versus what it looks like afterwards in the trade?
Right. So there's been numerous studies now demonstrating that. So there's a group of brain regions called the default mode network, and these are the brain regions that are on when you're not thinking about anything particular, right? And so when we have people lying in the MRI scanner, not doing anything particular, these are the brain regions that are on. And you think that everyone would be different, but there's actually, again, like a core network that seems to be on in pretty much everybody. And what happened, and this network has been associated with mind wandering and rumination and sort of thinking about the self. And what we see is that during meditation, this network gets turned down. And that then also when we look over the course of 8 weeks, we see that on average, like even when you're lying there doing nothing, this network is less active after the 8 weeks of meditation compared to 8 weeks of, some sort of control condition. And then in long-term meditators, we see that, long-term meditators versus controls, that this network is less active in general. So it really does suggest that with meditation practice, so you're in that moment, you're turning it down, and then it's staying down more frequently, even in the long term.
Yeah, I'm looking for analogies in other parts of life. It might be perhaps a little bit that if we go to the gym regularly, when we're actually in the gym, we might be able to run pretty quickly or lift relatively heavy weights. But then we'd also find that when we're not in the gym and we're just hanging out and need to run to catch a bus, we can run more quickly to catch the bus. The capacity has developed, so we encounter that capacity on a more regular basis, even if we're not trying to develop it during the rest of the times. Yeah.
And what we're thinking is that, because again, we know this has a lot to do with the wiring of the brain, and so the idea is that somehow with meditation practice, the wiring in this network is changing so that, it's still there, but it's less quiet and it's more quiet and it's less active.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is the notion, that often gets expressed to us lay people, that neurons that fire together, wire together, right? That whatever we exercise a lot in the brain is what the brain will tend to do.
Exactly.
All other things being equal.
Exactly.
So, a lot of people will go into training of some sort. Let's say they'll take, there's a kind of one standard form of mindfulness practice of learning mindfulness is an 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction course in which people are spending, a few hours a week in a class, and they're supposed to be practicing each day. And that's often used whether in clinical interventions or I think in some of your research as a kind of okay, let's see what happens before and after that. But do we know much about what happens if somebody goes beyond a training course and starts doing these practices over years or decades?
Yeah. So there's starting to be a few studies. Again, most of the studies are just 8 weeks. But there's starting to be a few studies. We have one now where we looked at people 1 year later, and there's also some that have looked at even like 18 months later. And what we see is that the brain continues to change, right? That definitely, and this for anyone who's ever started practicing meditation, that it's not like you get meditation completely in 8 weeks. And that the more you practice, again, sort of like with physical benefits, the muscles are going to continue to develop. And that definitely happens, is that those changes become stronger over the course. The changes we see over the course of the 8 weeks get stronger, but we also see new additional changes as well. And there's also growing evidence that the different practices have different benefits and different brain changes associated with them, which sort of makes sense. If again, exercise is a good analogy here. Like if I'm a runner, then obviously my leg muscles are going to be really well developed, and my arm muscles are going to get kind of sort of developed, but mostly it's going to be my leg muscles, right, and very specific muscles in my legs. But then if I do, say, ice skating or weightlifting or something like that, that's going to develop other muscles. And so all sorts of exercise are good for general cardiovascular fitness. And there's going to be some effects, like if I'm, again, like even though I'm running, there's going to be some effect on my arms. So similarly with the different types of meditation, they all seem to be turning off this default mode network. But then there's other benefits. So say compassion meditation versus mindfulness versus, say, a mantra meditation, they all seem to have slightly different brain patterns associated with them.
Can you give us an idea as a neuroscientist of the sort of the map you have for different meditation practices? I imagine that there's a number of different categories that you would tend to sort, because there are thousands of different practices, right, that have developed in thousands of different cultures. But I imagine that they cluster in some ways. Can you give us an idea of what the categories are?
The short answer is no. It's way more complex than that. So there hasn't been a whole lot of studies where we compared one person doing 2 or 3 different types of meditation, right? There have been 1 or 2 studies with that. So again, like mindfulness versus compassion meditation, they showed that there are similarities, but there's also differences. But then there was a really interesting study done with EEG where they went to Asia and they studied people in Tibetan Buddhism versus people who practice Buddhism in the Theravada tradition in, I think it was Thailand. And they had both of them do a focused concentration practice and an open awareness practice. And the idea was that, okay, well, focused attention in Tibet and focused attention in Thailand should be the same. And, the open awareness in both places should be the same. But what they found was no. And actually there was more similarities between the 2 different styles of Tibetans doing open versus Tibetans doing focused, and Thai people doing focus versus Thai people doing open were more similar to each other, and they were very, very, very different from each other. So, open versus open was very different than, and so it's definitely, there's what you're doing, but also how you've been taught to do it. There's little subtleties. Even in my own study, which sort of gets at this, we had put people through a relaxation response program or a mindfulness-based stress reduction program. And both of them, they learn a body scan, right? Where you move your attention through your body. But in the relaxing body scan, they say, okay, notice this area and relax it. Then notice this area and relax it. Versus in the mindful body scan, they just say, be aware, be aware, be aware, be aware. Right? So identical other than that intention, so be aware or be aware and relax. And we can see differences in the brain between these 2. So it's like really subtle differences are going to have, subtle differences on the brain.
Yeah, so it's going to be hard to make generalizations about types of practice given all this variety. I remember, we had, we had this Harvard Medical School conference back in 2009 when the Dalai Lama came. Remember that? And there was one point where our mutual friend and colleague, Chris Germer, asked His Holiness to please lead everybody in a meditation practice. We thought, how cool is this? 1,100 psychotherapists and researchers, and the Dalai Lama was going to lead us all in meditation. He just started cracking up laughing. And he said, I think you want one single type of meditation and 100% sort of positive. Well, impossible. And he went on to say that there are thousands and thousands of different kinds of meditation. The mind is so complex that it's really hard to say anything definitive or pick one that's going to be somehow useful for everybody in every circumstance.
It's true. It's very, very true. We're starting to see that in the clinical space too, that, so for instance, compassion meditation, it's really, you would think that, most people would love compassion meditation, but actually some people really don't, and it really doesn't work and sort of backfires in a big way for some people. Versus other people really, really, really need the compassion before they can do mindfulness. And so we're starting to see hints of this in the clinical space, but we're not quite there yet. But so it's definitely one size does not fit all.
Right. So given that context, I'm still going to ask you about something that maybe we can have generalizations about. There are certainly some people that choose to do fairly intensive practices, whether going on a silent retreat where you spend the whole day practicing for many days or even weeks in a row. And then there are other forms of practice that are decidedly lighter in intensity. I'm going to sit for 10 minutes a day or 20 minutes a day, or I'll simply do informal mindfulness practices. Things like when I take a shower, I'm going to pay attention to the sensations of the shower. Do we have evidence about how different levels of intensity affect the brain?
Not like that, no, not quite example. But we do know, because this is a question I would get, is like, do I have to practice 30 minutes every day? So we did or 40 minutes a day, right? Because this is what usually you're told to do. And of course, Headspace is so popular now. 10 minutes a day, that's all you need is 10 minutes a day. So we did a study where we randomized people to 10 minutes a day, 40 minutes a day, or 10 minutes a day, 3 times a week, and 40 minutes a day, 3 times a week. And our hypothesis would be that that third group would do the best, because we figured, okay, because so the general idea was that, because we know if you tell people to practice every day for 40 minutes, most people don't do that, right? But we thought, okay, 10 minutes a day, people can do 10 minutes a day. So we thought we'd have much better compliance with 10 minutes a day. And we thought, okay, well, that middle group, because they had the option to do either 10 or 40, that they would probably practice every day, and at least a couple times a week, they would practice 40 minutes. And what we found was no, that so it was true that the 10 minutes a day group had almost perfect compliance. The 40 minutes a day group had mixed compliance, but so did the hybrid group. In fact, the compliance was similar between the two groups, the hybrid group and the 40 minutes a day group. So they didn't practice 10 minutes a day even on the days when they only practice a couple times a week. But only the 40 minutes a day group had changes in stress. And there was no change in stress in the 10 minutes a day group. And it's a small study, right? So maybe we had a larger sample, blah, 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 the whole thing. So it really does suggest, at least for stress, that, clearly you get some benefit from 10 minutes a day. There's been a couple studies where people have been told 10 minutes a day, and you can see small changes. But it really does suggest that practicing 40 minutes a day provides benefits. And part of it was also just that, there's more total minutes per day or per week in the 40 minutes a day, even though they didn't practice every day. And definitely in the brains, what we're seeing is that it does seem like just total time makes a difference. There's a correlation between some of our brain changes and just total number of lifetime hours of practice. So it does seem like it's a cumulative, but obviously if all you got is 10 minutes a day, practice 10 minutes a day. But if you can practice 20, 30, 40 minutes a couple times a week, that's going to give you more benefit.
Yeah, so that's interesting, and I imagine the data isn't this granular, but what would your guess be about the difference between sitting for 40 minutes in one session versus sitting for 10 minutes 4 times a day?
Yeah, it's hard to know. It probably would also depend a lot on if it's an experienced person or if it's a novice. Because with novices, maybe they're sitting for 40 minutes a day, but how much of that time they're actually focused, so I don't know. So one of my very first studies was with long-term meditation practitioners, and I had them practice for just 20 minutes in the scanner. And the feedback I got from several of them was like, why did you stop at 20 minutes? That's when I'm just trying to settle down and get focused. It was really interesting. It was like 3 or 4 different people gave me that feedback specifically. Like, I need the 20 minutes just to settle down. And so if you're only practicing 10 minutes a day, you're never going to get to that point where your mind settles down. And so again, but there's absolutely no data on that other than, again, these little anecdotes here and there.
Yeah.
So probably, there is something about practicing for longer periods, if you're really focused and really can do the 40 minutes. If you're sitting there just whatever, then who knows? But
yeah. That's that. I may have been one of the subjects that said that in that early study, because that's definitely my subjective experience is the first 15 or 20 minutes, not in the context of a retreat or something, but where I'm doing it regularly. But the first 15 or 20 minutes, if I'm dropping in from busy life, it's mostly spinning, thinking about the busy life issues. And then more space tends to open up. So it's an interesting question as to whether those subsequent 20 minutes are of a different quality, and therefore the neurons that are firing together are actually wiring the brain in a different way than during the first 20 minutes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What I find interesting also is that lots of times, like on retreats, especially first thing in the morning, there's chanting, right? And there's a lot of meditation traditions where you chant for 10, 15, 20 minutes before you meditate. And I started wondering, like, is that why? Is that because, your mind's going to be all over the place? So use that first 10, 15, 20 minutes, use the mantra or not necessarily mantra, but chanting of some sort.
The group activity because chanting has a rather, if we think of vividness of anchor for meditation practice, chanting, you're quite involved with your body. It's a very vivid thing. And since the whole rest of the group is chanting, there's a lot of impetus to come back to the object of attention, to the chanting. Whereas if you're just with your breath, the mind can go all over the place.
Exactly. And it's really hard. I mean, your mind starts to wander and like you can't think because everyone's chanting.
Right,
so,
exactly.
Yeah. And so it really helps to keep you focused. And then that gets through those first 20 minutes where your mind's all over the place. And then so I'm wondering if that may be part of the reason why they do, so you start thinking the precepts and the whatnot. So
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, personally, when I'm in a bad thought storm, either I'm upset about something or I'm obsessing about something. For me, the big guns are first do a bunch of aerobic exercise to release enough of the tension that's being held in a very gross way in the muscles, then do some like hatha yoga practice to stretch and further let go. And then I can sit and actually have some hope of noticing my breath for part of the experience or something. Because without that, my nervous system is likely to just spin out in thought.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, when I first started doing, because in my mind, it's all over the place. So, when I first started learning about meditation, I always had to start with yoga, like always. Like I couldn't just sit down and meditate. I always had to start with the yoga. And I know a lot of people who, even though they've been practicing for years, they always start with a few minutes of metta or mantra, for this very reason, because again, they can't just, and then our good friend, Bill Morgan, he calls it like you're on a highway and you need an off ramp. And so doing these sorts of practices are sort of like the off ramp to sort of slow you down, and get you so that you can then, hit the little slide road, at a nice quiet pace.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And, and obviously a lot of people turn to aerobics and physical and other forms of physical exercise for psychological as well as physical well-being. I do, but others do too. And have there been studies about the differential effects of physical exercise versus other forms of meditation that aren't moving the body?
Definitely, yes. So we actually did a study where we took people who are highly stressed and we randomized them to mindfulness-based stress reduction or to exercise.
And just for people who aren't so familiar with it, so mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBSR, is this 8-week structured program that I had mentioned before of a few hours a week of classes and practicing on your own in between.
Right. So you're told to practice every day for 40 minutes of silent meditation. And it can be, there's 3 different practices that are taught. So one is, breath awareness. One is a body scan where you're moving your attention slowly through your body, slowly over the course of 40 minutes. And then the third is a very gentle yoga, right? And so this is not the yoga you get at gyms. It's like, okay, as I'm moving my arms, how do I know where my arms are? How do I know my arms are moving? Like, what's the actual sensation in my arms as I'm moving, right? So it's really about practicing mindfulness while moving. In the exercise group, they got TheraBands, and so they were doing like stretching exercises. So they were very much obviously paying attention to their body and sort of doing some of the same moves that you do in yoga, but there was no mindfulness, right? And they also got information about diet and sleep and these sorts of things. And we did a fear conditioning protocol, which is where you're in the scanner and you see various different colored lights, and you get shocked to some lights but not other lights. And so they learned that, okay, when I see a red light, I can get shocked. There wasn't always a red light. Sometimes it's green, yellow, blue, right? So they learn let's say in this case, red light means I'm going to get shocked. Blue light means I'm safe. They learn that. Then we show them the red light, but we don't shock them. So they learn, okay, red light now means I'm safe. They go home, they come back the next day, and then we show them the red light and also the blue light. And we say, okay, and we don't shock them though. And we say, how do they respond to the red light? Do they respond to the red light like they're going to get shocked? Or like if they're safe? Like, have they remembered that red light means I'm safe now? And what we see is that there's a big difference between the two groups, right? So that the controls who got the exercise, they forgot, right? Versus the meditators, they remembered.
Just to clarify, so having forgotten, they were still having and manifesting this conditioned fear response to the red light. They hadn't gotten the message internalized that it's safe now.
Exactly. And this has a lot of implications for, like, say, the obvious one is PTSD, right? So the war veteran who comes home, hears the car backfire and startles. It's like, because he's forgotten that he's home, he's safe, right? Or like, it's very important for phobias, right? So the way you treat phobias is, so say you have a spider phobia, like you look at pictures of those spiders and then you bring the spider in, and you get up close and personal to the spider, right? But if you're not open to it, right? If you're like all like, oh God, there's a spider here, you're not going to get the benefits of being exposed to the spider, right? And so then you go home, you see the spider and you're still freaked out. And so this is what we're seeing, is that the meditation was helping them not be upset about the fact that they're seeing the lights and the red light means I'm going to get shocked, right? And that they remembered, they could learn that red light means I'm safe, and they really learned that. And so again, this has direct implications for trauma and phobias and whatnot. The cool thing in the brain we saw was that in the controls, they had more brain activity in a visual attention area, which is associated with vigilance, right? So it was really clear that they were paying attention to the lights and trying to figure out, okay, red light, blue light, what's going on, versus the meditators were paying attention to their hand, right? And we didn't tell them to meditate. We didn't tell them to pay attention to their hand. We didn't tell them to be mindful. We just said, you're going to go in the scanner, you're going to get shocked. And spontaneously, they are paying attention to their hand and just chilling out and paying attention to their hand and being mindful of their body, rather than trying to figure out the lights, right? In this, stressed out kind of way. And so it was really beautiful demonstration that, because lots of times you're like, okay, yeah, mindfulness of the body, whatever, it's kind of boring. And you think of it as just, it's something to pay attention to, but it's really clear that no, it's got real benefits, in terms of, when you're out in the world and you're dealing with real life, that being mindful of the body, this goes back to what we talked about at the beginning. Like, if you practice being mindful of the body when you're meditating, then when you're out in the real world, you're going to come back to your body, be mindful of your body when you encounter things. And that's going to provide real benefits, compared to just exercising.
Yeah, well, it's so interesting. In trauma treatment, we so often talk about grounding exercises, meaning exercises to bring the attention back to something very simple in the body, here and now, like the sensations of the feet touching the ground, or something literally like that, so as to create a sense of safety, and it's going to be okay, and to not be in a vigilant way, scanning for danger all the time. It sounds like your meditators spontaneously sought refuge in the body.
Exactly. And we also did a study with long-term meditators where we put them in a scanner. We didn't show them lights. We just gave them a obnoxious heat stimulus. And again, they paid attention to their hand. Like normally, you put someone in, that what the brain does is it shuts down sensory cortex. And we saw that with the meditators, they're turning up the signal in the sensory cortex. So they're paying more attention to it. But the part of the brain's like, oh, I don't like it, and defending against the pain, that got turned off in the meditators.
And so that was relatively quiet.
Yeah, exactly. And again, we see the exact opposite in the controls, because again, part of the brain literally shuts down sensory cortex so you don't feel it. And then meditators were letting the signal through and they were feeling it. And so again, this idea that, you can't stop the pain of life, and we know that being open to it and not defending against it is way more healthy psychologically.
Yeah. Well, and this is super important when we start to think of emotional pain, isn't it? That, one of the things we learn in many forms of meditative practice is that emotional pain is physical pain, right? That if we're feeling sadness or fear or anger, these are bodily sensations. They may have images or thoughts with them, but they're bodily sensations. So what you're suggesting is that people learn through meditation practice, and I assume this is a form of mindfulness practice that they were doing, that they can open to the physical pain, and indeed in the brain you see them opening to the physical pain and having less agitated distress about the pain as a result.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, in the brain, physical and emotional pain overlap.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they do phenomenologically, they overlap too. So that would make sense. It's interesting. You can actually see that. So I'm imagining, speaking now as a clinician, so much of what we try to do with people clinically is help them develop the courage and have sufficient resources so that they can feel the full range of feeling, including those that are painful. And you're saying, well, if we look at that at the level of the brain, that's for good reason, that there will be less of this distressed reactivity about emotions if we're able to feel them.
Right. And this gets into another thing we found is the amygdala. So the amygdala is like the fear center of the brain. And one of the findings that's most consistent is that the amygdala, the structure and the function and the functional connectivity of the amygdala changes with meditation, even after just 8 weeks. Like, we're seeing really radical changes in the amygdala. And again, it's very consistent. This idea that it's less active, it's less reactive, it's quieter, after just 8 weeks of practice. And so this is going to have huge implications for all sorts of anxiety.
And for us lay people, functional connectivity means what exactly?
So no brain region works alone. No brain region is an island. It's all connected to other parts of the brain. But who you're connected and how strongly you're connected to other parts of the brain varies tremendously from person to person. And that's what drives, again, individual differences. And so what we see is that, the amygdala, because if it's firing all the time and saying danger, 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 and then that quiets down. And so what we're seeing is there's sort of more top-down control of it, and that it gets smaller in general. And so it's sending out less fear signals. And so it's not connected to as many places saying, hey, danger, danger, danger.
And by top down, do you mean what we think of as our higher cortical processes, our ability to think, to reason, to have perspective on a circumstance?
Exactly, right. And so again, the front of the brain, we saw there was so this was actually with anxiety patients. And so it's interesting. So people with general anxiety and social anxiety, if you show them a completely neutral face, their amygdala fires crazy, because what's going on? I don't know. Is this person happy? What's this person thinking? I don't know. Right. And they've shown that, so normal reaction to happy faces, normal reaction to angry faces, but those neutral faces, they respond to like an angry face. Right. So it's like danger. And what we saw was that, again, after just 8 weeks, that normalized. And it had to do with in the front of the brain and the amygdala. So the front of the brain was telling the amygdala, okay, it's okay. And it was sort of, so paying attention, so it's aware, but not reacting. And that change in the reactivity of the amygdala was correlated with decreases in anxiety.
Yeah. Basically, somehow the meditation practice had a similar function of, as would a reassuring, non-anxious friend, right? Who's present, saying, this may not actually be threatening.
Exactly. Yeah. It's fascinating to me.
No, it's very, very interesting. Can I ask you about something that I don't know how much you can say about the neurobiology of this, but so often people initially may turn to meditation practices, mindfulness practice, for example. John Kabat-Zinn called the program we've been talking about mindfulness-based stress reduction. They'll do it to try to reduce stress. And yet in many cultural traditions and some of the ones that a lot of practices we use in Western medicine derive from, there's a spiritual aspect to this. And it doesn't have to be spiritual in the sense of religious, but certainly spiritual in the sense of diminishing self-preoccupation, diminishing ego concerns, connecting to something larger than ourselves, whether in theistic terms, God or the divine, or in non-theistic terms, nature, common humanity, something like that. Do you see neurobiological markers of this way? Can we see at the level of the brain?
Definitely. So this goes back to the default mode network, right? Because the default mode network is all about me. And again, that's getting shut down and quieter with more practice. Also, some of our newer research shows that, because again, nothing is working alone. What the default mode network is talking to changes with practice. And it looks like with the really long-term experienced practitioners that is hooking into, so A is getting quieter, and then it's hooking into a part of the brain that's involved in meaning making and perspective taking. So being able to see the bigger picture, the wider picture, being able to see things from other people's point of view, and then making meaning of it. And so how does this relevant to me? And, incorporating new experiences into my life rather than just being the same old. And we saw that was really, really clear. And what's interesting is that study, we looked at both long-term yoga practitioners and long-term meditation practitioners, and we saw much bigger changes in the meditation practitioners compared to the yoga practitioners, even though the yogis had twice as many lifetime hours of practice. So this also gets back to the question of, meditation A versus meditation B and yoga versus meditation and whatnot. Because that's a question I often get, like, is yoga meditation? And so yes, because definitely the yogis had more of this than non-practitioners, but the meditators really, it was really clear that they were doing more of this than the yogis.
And the chief variable here was kind of perspective taking and the ability to connect experience to a bigger picture in some way.
Exactly, right. And sort of, again, so we don't really know what is spirituality in the brain, but there's, again, this thing of seeing the bigger picture. It's really clearly that these are some of the regions that are involved in that.
Yeah, so it's so interesting because hearkening back to that the conference with his Dalai Lama, afterwards we edited and put together a book, as you recall, being part of that, on wisdom and compassion in psychotherapy. And part of that endeavor involved looking up or looking into, what does Western science know about wisdom? And in fact, there is a whole body of research about that. And while the people have difficulty describing it, if you go big picture on various cultures' views of wisdom, it usually coalesces around whatever happens, having a sense of its import, including the consequences of our actions, for the near term and the long term, and for those close to us and those more distant from us, as opposed to foolishness, which people do define, the folks who study this, as, basically, what are the implications of this for me now? And we see this, right? When we think of somebody as acting in a way that's immature, it's mostly, what are the implications of this for me now, right? And when they're wise or mature, and I would suggest more awakened, there's a sense of, no, they're really taking in this big context. So that's very interesting what you're describing, because it would seem to parallel that.
Exactly,
that
right.
Sense that wisdom shows up in the brain in this way and is cultivated by these practices.
Right. And so it's really cool, and it makes a lot of sense, because again, if this is what you're practicing over and over again, that this is, the reason why the Buddha taught these practices is because they seem to help with this, maturing.
Yeah. Well, and it's also interesting that one of the questions that the wisdom researchers spend a lot of time on is whether people get wiser as they get older. Right. And it's an interesting question just to ponder. What do I think in general? Do people get wiser as they get older? And the answer seems to be, it depends. And what it seems to depend on is somewhat whether people are involved in things that are designed to help increase wisdom. I think of it sometimes as analogous to the question of, do people get better at playing the piano as they get older? Well, that has to do with whether they practice the piano and whether they want to or not. If I don't practice, probably not. So that would seem to also be fitting what you're discovering.
Exactly. And I think a lot of it also is, are you open and are you learning from life, right? So much of it is, because wisdom comes from experience, right? And so, and learning from your mistakes and, not having set views and being open to hearing other people's point of views. This is, one of the hallmarks of people at these highest stages of maturity and whatnot, is that if someone disagrees with them, rather than saying, oh, you're wrong, they're like, let's sit down and discuss this. I want to understand. Yeah. Maybe I'm not understanding completely. So what am I missing?
Right.
Very, very, very different move. Yeah.
And just before we end, you've touched on so many things. Where do you imagine that the field is going, and what's most exciting to you about the field of studying the neuroscience of meditation?
Yeah, it's an interesting time right now. For the past 20 years, and it has been 20 years, so much of the research has been focused on these 8-week programs and clinical programs. And now there's much more interest in the long-term effects. And also in some of these, advanced meditation states, especially with the resurgence of psychedelics, because, the overlap between the psychedelic states and some of the meditation states. So there's a lot of interest right now, people trying to understand similarities and differences between those. There's also a lot of interest right now in using devices to help people learn. So neurofeedback, or brain stimulation and whatnot. And also trying to better understand, okay, this type of meditation versus that type of meditation versus this type of meditation, and what's the same, what's the difference, what's going on exactly. So all that's sort of going on. And then what I'm most interested in is sort of, this goes back to the question of state versus trait, is I'm very interested in the trait and, how our traits change. And we think of traits as being stable, and they are fairly stable, but gradually over time, they do change with meditation practice. We become calmer, we become wiser, we become, more intuitive, all these things. And so trying to map some of that territory is what I'm most interested in right now.
Mm. And this is a terrible thing to ask a scientist, because scientists are supposed to be open-minded and just inquisitive. But if you were to take a wild guess about what we might be discovering in the next 5 or 10 years, do you have such guesses?
That's a good question. I think most likely we'll have a better understanding of meditation A versus meditation B. And also in terms of into the clinical space, you need compassion, you need mindfulness, you need tai chi, you need normal talk therapy. I think those are probably the two things that are most ripe right now and most likely to happen in the next 5 years.
Yeah, this generates a little fantasy for me. I was just with some friends. We're talking about the sort of empirical research on couples therapy, and what are the signs that a couple's likely to be able to stay together, and what are the signs that they're not likely to stay together. And imagining now that AI can, read our faces and certainly read our transcribe our words, that will there simply be couples observed by computers for half an hour and then basically told, don't worry about the therapy. Let's talk about how you're going to separate versus, this is really workable. But a similar fantasy here about, might there be a way to have sufficient data about the different patterns so that we can better guide people in what would be of use to them in the meditative space.
Yeah, so there's so much to do. I mean, again, we've been doing this for 20 years, and I feel like we're just starting to scratch the surface.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for spending this time and sharing your knowledge and wisdom around this with us. If people want to learn more about your work, where would you direct them?
I have a website, and there's links there to all my publications, and there's a couple little things about my research there. So that's probably the best place.
And just tell people the name of the website.
So it's a long one, and actually, I don't even. I think it's like MGH/Harvard/Sara Lazar. I think.
Oh, so what would they Google?
So my name and MGH, I'll definitely find it.
Okay, MGH, and that for those of you not in the Boston area,
Okay.
that stands for Massachusetts General Hospital. So that's the MGH there.
Right,
Okay,
or Sara Lazar Harvard. Either way, you'll find me. Yeah.
Great. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.